The Harlem Renaissance was a time of cultural renewal among African Americans concurrent with the Jazz Age during the 1920s. It centered on the activities of African American writers, artists, and musicians in the Harlem district of New York City. African American artists during this time inspired activists and artists during the Civil Rights Movement. How It Feels to Be Free, Black Women Entertainers in the Civil Rights Movement, written by Ruth Feldstein, who is a history professor focusing on American Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University in 2013, focuses on Black women entertainers and their relationships to the Civil Rights and Black Power movement. Her methodology focuses on 6 performers: singer and film star Lena Horne, South African singer Miriam Makeba, pianist and vocalist Nina Simone, jazz singer and actress Abby Lincoln, and film actresses Diane Carroll and Cicely Tyson. She shows that all 6 of these were more than, quote, just entertainers. They took risks as they used their celebrity status to support the civil rights movement. And so there was a political, cultural, and gender crossover during this research. She highlights newspapers like the New York Times, Chicago Defender, The Guardian, the Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal. She uses autobiographies and biographies, magazines like Show Business Illustrated and Ebony, secondary sources about the larger civil rights movement, perspective on African American women, how society viewed them. And she concludes that recovering the stories of these ladies allows us to place these women at the center of Black activism and women's liberation. This relates to my research in that it gives me another layer of comparison. Athletes used their platform, entertainers also used their platform. In Freedom Sounds, Civil Rights Call Out to Jazz and Africa, Ingrid Monson, Quincy Jones Professor of African American Music at Harvard University, considers the political, social, economic, and even structural practical aspects of life in the jazz world during the 1950s and 1960s. She offers a critical look at the relationships between music, racism, and society during the civil rights era. And she gives an examination of the impact the civil rights movement and African independence had on jazz in the 1950s and 1960s. And she traces the relationship between music, politics, culture, art, and activism through the lens of racial activism and the civil rights movement. She argues that the debates within the civil rights movement, the idea of African independence, and the Black Power movement shaped jazz as an art form and placed pressure on musicians to get involved. Her methodology focuses on the intersection of jazz as an art form, a social community, and an economic livelihood. She also gives a domestic and global perspective and places all of these arguments within the framework of Jim Crow policies that were existent in the musical world during this time. The bottom line is that jazz influenced the conversation between race, politics, economics, and civil rights, and the civil rights movement influenced the art form of jazz. She uses archival research, oral histories, telephone interviews with artists and musicians, musical analysis of jazz pieces, panel discussions, newspapers. She concludes that jazz and musicians were at center stage when it came to issues of modernism and modernity, Black nationalism, the legal definitions of race, Jim Crow society, and global discussions of independence and freedom. This relates to my research in that it's another example of the intersection of culture, society, and race. It shows that the civil rights movement was more than the March on Washington, more than the Montgomery bus boycott, and there are many different lenses through which we can study and learn.